Actress Jane Alexander.
You know, the other thing that I love about Martin Ritt is he devoted his career to making socially relevant movies.
Yes. He wanted to do those kinds of films, and God bless them, they were wonderful. Do you remember one called The Molly Maguires? It was about mining. I loved that film.
They were Irish. They were Catholic. They were rebels.
They're calling themselves the Molly Maguires.
The film did not do well. Ritt was always very, very sad about the fate of the Molly Maguires because I think he felt closer to that film than any of his others. It was too full of shades of gray to be a successful commercial project.
The Molly Maguires was the first of two films that director Martin Ritt made that decade that dealt with labor unions, the second being the extremely popular Norma Rae in 1976. Sadly, this cinematic treatment of one of history's most infamous and violent labor protests went largely unseen by wide audiences upon its release. But it stands proudly alongside Ritt's other films as a work of great ambition. Before we delve into the intricacies of the film, here's a little historical context. Author of Making Sense of the Molly Maguires, Kevin Kinney.
Tell me about the Molly Maguires. The Irish that they sent back to the Pennsylvania area, it was the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and they needed workers. Is that what inspired the movie?
They needed labor, and in the 19th century, the Irish were the chief source of unskilled manual labor, physical brawn, the people who did the digging and the heavy lifting. So the Anthracite region of Pennsylvania, it's the region that stretches from Scranton in the north down to Pottsville. It's a very distinctive part of the world. Firstly, it contains most of the world's anthracite. Anthracite is a particular form of coal. It's the purest form of coal. Very valuable commodity in the context of the American Industrial Revolution. It requires labor and plenty of it, and most of that labor is immigrant labor. So what happens is, in that context, the mine workers form a trade union, the Working Men's Benevolent Association, which is the largest and most powerful trade union in the country in the late 1860s and early 1870s. What's interesting about that union is that it's open to all workers, skilled and unskilled, Catholic and Protestant, Irish and British. And so it unites the working class in one industrial union, which is very powerful. Molly Maguires is a small group, a desperate group. They consist of the most alienated, least skilled of the Irish, the ones who are most likely to be Irish speakers, to come from the most remote regions of Ireland, the ones who have most difficulty assimilating into American life. So you kind of have two organizations emerging in parallel, and they have different tactics. The tactic of the trade union movement is to sit down across the table, representatives of labor, representatives of capital, collective bargaining, hammer out an agreement, and if things are not working, the weapon that the union uses is the strike. The Molly Maguires have a very different tactic. It's much more direct, immediate, and individual. So what they'll do is, if there's a problem in a mine where the Irish are being discriminated against or the Welsh are getting higher pay for the same work, they will go directly to the mine boss and deliver a warning. If that warning is ignored, they'll come back to his house and they'll post a piece of paper. They'll nail a piece of paper to the door with a picture of a coffin on it and the words, "This will be yours." That's a coffin notice. And ultimately, in both Ireland and the United States, the ultimate sanction is they will physically assault or they will kill.
Ultimately, the Molly Maguires were convicted of 16 murders, and 20 of its members were hanged, thanks in large part to another Irish immigrant, James Mcparland, a detective who went undercover inside the mines to befriend and root out the Molly Maguires. In the filmed version of this history, Sean Connery plays Jack Kehoe, the leader of the Molly Maguires, and Richard Harris plays Detective Mcparland. In their approach to fleshing out the story, the facts and nuances of which are still hotly debated to this day, Ritt and producer-screenwriter Walter Bernstein were faced with a bit of a moral quagmire.
I think in a way they're caught in a bind, right? Because there's an ambiguity there that actually runs through the movie, because Ritt and Bernstein want to condemn the figure of the informant unequivocally, but in no way do they want to endorse, let alone glorify, violence.
And I guess from a motivational standpoint, how could you be embedded with that group of men for so long and not establish some kind of empathy or rapport with them or identification?
Oh, yeah, and the movie really plays that up.
Do you think you really could have won? Well, then why?
You know why as much as me. You worked down there. Could you see yourself not lifting a finger?
I wouldn't stay down there. I'd get out.
And why would you find it different?
Why didn't you stop, Jack? I tried to get you to stop.
Author of the films of Martin Ritt, Fanfare for the Common Man, Gabriel Miller.
Mcparland, who is the informer in the Molly Maguires, is presented as a fairly attractive character for much of the film. He's handsome, he's charismatic, he's charming. He even comes, even though he's there to spy on the Molly Maguires, he begins to sympathize with them during the course of the film. And at the end, he's very, very conflicted on what he wants to do, on what he has to do. And even though he does it, the audience develops a certain amount of sympathy for him. And I think the ending of that movie is very, very brutal in its treatment of Mcparland and its treatment of Kehoe, the head of the Molly Maguires. And the audience did not know what to make of it.
In the climactic scene of the movie, the detective is Mcparland. He's played by Richard Harris. He comes to see Sean Connery in his jail cell. But in that scene, there's a confrontation. Kehoe says to Mcparland,
You came for absolution.
You're not a priest, Jack.
You'd like to be set free from what you've done.
I'm not that soft.
Oh, you don't want forgiven. You can get that from a woman. Punishment. That's what you want. You think punishment will set you free. And that's why you've come. Looking for punishment.
So what he's referring to there is, in Irish culture, the most reviled figure is the informant. It's a trope in Irish culture. Kehoe saying to Mcparland that, you want me to forgive you. You want absolution. You even want to do penance for what you've done. And then they fight. And the last line of that scene,
You'll never be free. There's no punishment this side of hell can free you from what you did.
See you in hell.
I mean, I do think that, especially that climactic scene, you'll never be free. There's no punishment this side of hell. I mean, it's a dramatization, but it surely can I think it can be read plausibly in the context of what happened during the blacklist.
Fear of communist subversive activities has developed into hysterical frenzy which grows daily. Appointed by Congress to investigate, Chairman Parnell Thomas opens the hearing.
Is investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry must not be considered or interpreted as an attack on the industry itself.
Martin Ritt was a World War II veteran who had just embarked on his directing career when he was identified as harboring communist sympathies by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Ritt was called before the committee, and promptly refused to name names. As he told the New York Times in 1979, a rat does that and has to live with it for the rest of his life. Ritt was blacklisted for 5 long years. Walter Bernstein was an Army correspondent during the war. After he was outed by the committee, he was blacklisted for a decade. Ritt and Bernstein were close friends, and at one point, they were even roommates. Creatively, they both shared a commitment to themes of social injustice. The trauma of the blacklist was reflected most explicitly in their 1976 collaboration, The Front. But there's more than a trace of it in other films directed by Ritt as well, including The Molly Maguires.
Mcparland informs against Kehoe. HUD brings on his father's death, but he doesn't actively kill him, his behavior. But in the Brotherhood, one brother actually kills another brother. And he's not only a brother, but since his brother raises him after their parents died, he's like a combination brother-father figure. And he kills him. He kills him for the corporate group that asks him to do it.
The other thought I had on this was the notion of guilt by association. So in the Molly Maguire story, the way it's told, you have individuals who are accused of murder or conspiracy to murder, but if you can establish that they were members of this organization, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, then in the courtroom that's taken as evidence of guilt. If you're a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, you're a Molly Maguire. If that connection has been made, the burden of evidence is heavily against you, and you're going to be convicted. And who's providing that evidence? The informant, James Mcparland, who in that sense is naming names, because if you look at the HUAC investigations, it was enough to say that you were involved in the New Deal Federal Theater project to have a big question mark placed over your head as to your left-leaning sympathies. So again, there's this idea of guilt by association is to me, is part of it. So there's the history of the Molly Maguires in the 19th century, and then there's this kind of interesting political and cultural history of filmmaking.